Shining bright lotus.
Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. It's great to see so many familiar faces, see quite a few familiar people. And so, I wrote A Heart Blown Open. I finished it in 2020. And Junpo died just about a year after I finished writing it. And I'm sorry, not A Heart Blown Open, When the Buddha Needs Therapy. And so I finished that book in 2020, then Junpo passed away. And really, When the Buddha Needs Therapy was my attempt to take sort of everything that I learned from Junpo and to distill it into one place, sort of my interpretation of what he had taught as I understood it. So that's kind of what you guys have been reading. Um, and it was an interesting process for me because like I really internalized what he said. I really had a sense of it. I really sort of um, began to live it in my life. And then Junpo had the audacity to die. And so it felt like right when I sort of had it in my hands and had 35 more questions that I really needed to ask him, he was gone. And so the process for me over the last, 4 years, 4.5 years, has been finding my way back to the Dharma without a Dharma teacher. And it's been a curious process. And one of the things I've done is in the last half year or so, I've come into pretty deep and intimate contact with Fujin and with Daiden, with Dragon Heart Sangha and the Sulin Zen, um, and have sort of found my home again and begun training again. And because I don't have questions, because I don't have Junpo to ask questions to, I've been going to the source, some of the source materials where Junpo trained and Rinzai. And the main one is a guy named Hakuin. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of Hakuin. He was a Zen monk. He lived from about 1680 to about 1770. And when he was born, Rinzai Zen was really kind of a joke. It had decayed into just a shadow of its former self in Japan. And Hakuin, when he was a boy, he was terrified of going to hell, the sort of in the folk religions of Japan at the time, and he was sort of obsessed with not going to hell. And so he became an ardent practitioner as a young guy, and then became a pretty strict meditator in his teens and his 20s. Um, and he had his first really big kensho when he was just 24 years old, a really deep awakening, and he realized not long afterwards that he didn't trust it. He didn't trust his kensho, so he continued to practice, he continued to train, and his awakening experiences would cause pretty intense physical and psychological breakdowns after he sort of awakened. And he realized that awakening without grounding creates intense instability. And so part of his life work was the creation of an integration of mind body unity. So integrating the breath with the Dantian, with the Qi. And, it's part of what we heard from Junpo a lot, right? Awakening is embodied. And that all comes directly from Hakuin. So Hakuin had a really deep, profound awakening experience in his 30s, later 30s. And he simultaneously had the belief, the idea that his insight was so deep that it may have been the deepest insight that anyone had had in hundreds of years. And he really took it in. And it gets to this question, can you choose enlightenment? And so Hakuin, chose enlightenment and he experienced it. And he went to see a hermit monk that was deeply awakened named Shoju. And when he showed up for Shoju asked him a few questions and then laughed in his face and called him a poor hole-dwelling devil and dismissed him. And Hakuin was shattered, right? It was like he realized that his enlightenment was very much incomplete. And so he dedicated himself again to practice. And this guy's practice was extreme. He would have his students tie him into a zazen position and then leave him for the night. So he was physically restrained, so he couldn't move. He couldn't come out of the posture until the morning when they would come in and untie him. He would take bamboo shards and put them like in the crux of his arms and his legs so he could press in and stab himself. So if he got sleepy on the cushion, he would just stab himself to increase his concentration, his attention, his devotion to his practice. And so he taught with this mix of clarity and compassion and ruthless precision, right? He was a lot like Junpo. He systematized koan practice. He was really about embodied training. He taught lay people, which was really revolutionary, like many of us. He was the one that came up with something that Junpo talked about a lot, was that you have to have great faith, great doubt, and great determination, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second here. He warned about false awakenings, which is also what I'm going to talk about here today. He was really one of the first ones to try to integrate mind and body in the practice. And he brought Zen back into everyday life, that the path of awakening is not a path. It's not actually the path of the monastery. It is actually the path of the everyday people, of the householders, as they call us. Okay. So in Mando Zen, we have the koan, who am I? And Hakuin asks three other ways that we can ask that koan, who am I? So the first way is, who am I? The second question that Hakuin would ask is, where am I? So when it snows, where are you? When you're in the mall, where are you? When you're sitting at Thanksgiving with your family, where are you? His third way of asking was, who is experiencing this? So no matter what arises, including a kensho, the question is always, who is experiencing this? Who is experiencing this? Who is experiencing this? And his fourth one is, who walks, who talks, who eats, and who sits in zazen? So this had to do with a really much more complete awakening he had, which he writes about. It's called the Four Ways of Knowing, and they're called the mirror knowing and universal knowing and observing knowing and differentiating knowing. Doesn't really matter. The most important thing to sort of hold as practitioners is that Hakuin didn't talk about, and he didn't believe in stages. He didn't believe in a hierarchy of awakening. That these four ways of knowing, they're not stages, they're lenses. They're four ways that are functioning in us right now. And practice teaches us how to recognize which one is speaking right now, which one we're coming through. This is very relevant when we talk about, can we choose awakening? So holding that in mind, holding these four ways of knowing in mind, that the next big thing that Hakuin would have us look at is something Junpo talked about a great deal, which is great faith, great doubt, and great determination. So great faith only comes about after you've had a kensho, after you've seen through the veil. You've experienced non-duality for yourself. The self has fallen away, and you've sat pure witnessing consciousness. That happens, it unfolds. The experience is that it goes away, and we come back. Which brings us to the second one, which is great doubt. The great doubt is that the realization that you may never, ever actually see with great clarity, that you may never fully awaken. And the great determination is that you resolve to practice through your entire lifetime, no matter how deep your insight becomes. And this was a great passion of Hakuin's. he was very hard on people that had versions of awakening, versions of the four knowings, and then would stop their practice because he felt that it was almost always incomplete. So Hakuin really believed that awakening is not about an absolute insight. He believed it's about integrating insight into the self. And that's really what When the Buddha Needs Therapy is all about. It's what Junpo is all about. That awakening is about integration. It's not about sitting in an absolute view. It's wrong. There is no such thing as an absolute view independent of the self in which it arises. It's the only way it can happen. So he had this beautiful, Hakuin had this beautiful metaphor that he would say, which he would say, the lotus, the lotus flower is always the big thing in Buddhism. And he would say, the lotus blooming in water withers near fire, but the lotus blooming in the midst of flames becomes all the more beautiful the closer the fire becomes. So a fire lotus. So what does that mean? Well, it means that everyday life is the fire. It means that we practiced in the fire, and the fire is actually what stabilizes awakening. And that any insight without integration will always collapse. This is why we practice in the midst of everyday life. This is why we do emotional koans. This is why this is why your angst is your liberation, as Junpo always taught. This is exactly what he's talking about, that a fire lotus knows and experiences that the more angst that you have in your life, the more capacity you have for self-liberation. It's just fuel. Hakuin said that if you practice in the midst of everyday life, it will be as if the empty sky vanished and the iron mountain crumbled. And so he really pushed for, he was very passionate about teaching lay people over monastics because he thought the lay people had a much deeper sense of what it was to be a fire lotus as opposed to a water lotus. And Junpo used to say that all the time. He would say, it's not that hard to awaken in a monastery. You don't really have any external pressures. You have no fires. Okay. So can you choose awakening? Well, can you choose awakening should really be a koan. So Hakuin liked to tell his students that he would grab something and he would say, if you call this a stick, I'll give you 30 blows. And if you don't call it a stick, I'll give you 30 blows. It's great, right? These are advanced koans. Call it a stick, I'll give you 30 blows. Don't call it a stick, and I'll give you 30 blows. Can you choose awakening? So what he's really trying to say is that conceptualization of the truth is a delusion. And avoiding conceptualization of the truth is also a delusion. How would one choose awakening? Can Keith just choose to be awakened? The way I'm going to choose to take a sip of my delicious coffee? Hakuin described this process, okay? He described it as one of his favorite metaphors was that you imagine you have a bamboo tube about this big, maybe 12 inches across, maybe 3 inches wide, sealed on both ends, sealed shut. And inside is a rat. And you're the rat. So you're sealed in this tube of bamboo. You can't go forward. And you can't go back. can't chew your way out, and you can't stay where you are. What do you do? That's how you choose awakening. You answer that. You can't go forward, you can't go back, you can't get out, and you can't stay where you are. So how I sit with that is that the world is fleeting, right? That everything you love and everyone you love, right? There's nothing permanent here. Junpo's gone. Your children will die, your friends will die, your spouse will die, you will die. You can't go forward and you can't go back and you can't chew your way out and you can't stay here. Somebody told me once that grief is the price of love. But grief is just the shadow that love casts when the light is bright enough. Right? That's part of what being in this tube is all about. So awakening doesn't free us from our humanity. It makes us more intimate with it. We don't get out of the tube. We don't become untrapped. The liberation that we seek, the liberation that we can choose, the only place that we have the capacity to make choice is in the realization that we are bound to this place, to these bodies, to this existence. And the freedom, liberation, awakening is being completely 100% inside of this process, inside of the ordinary mind, the ordinary ways where life and death are seen through. It's so very simple. But it's not a choice of awakening, it's a choice of accepting what is. So, Junpo, one of the things he modeled for me that was so powerful was that he loved fully, he grieved fully, he practiced fully. That's the lotus blooming in the fire. Right? He tells that beautiful story of when his brother died of AIDS. And so beautiful. He's telling me the story sitting on his couch. He's drinking a beer. Tears are just kind of rolling down his face. And after his brother died, I said, "What did you do?" He said, "Well, I went out to the street and I tore the shirt off my body and I pounded the pavement and I wept. And I came back in and I washed his body and I wrapped it and I called 911. That's what I did. That's awakening." I think that's enough.
shining bright lotus.